As time goes by, more people are realising that COVID-19 was a monumental fraud. However, as one fear-based narrative falls, others are springing up in their place. One of these has been the parasite narrative. That is the notion that our health is being compromised by a variety of tiny invaders that may be on us or inside us. Many in the so-called freedom community are promoting this theme, but it is also a mainstream one, and the Wikipedia page, List of Parasites of Humans, boasts over 80 diseases. In this video, we'll take a look at how the situation came about and why the term parasite may be inappropriate when it comes to human biology. Also exposed are some early 1900s human experiments that have been used to this day to uphold the parasite narrative. Keep watching to find out how they inadvertently disproved the entire hypothesis.
Look at the lovely Renee and Roger. Hello.
Hi.
They're going to tell you something about this business.
It isn't the germs that matter, but that upon which they prey. Dr. Ulrich Williams, Terrain Therapy. Whenever we research a topic, one of the most important starting points is establishing correct meanings and if they have changed over time. Those of you familiar with our work will know how the definitions of words were being changed before our very eyes during the COVID-19 era. On this theme, please watch our interview, The Greatest Scam Exposed with Etienne Delaboussi. Etienne's research outlines who controls the dictionaries and how words are changed to suit the narratives of those with vested interests. These days, the word parasite is usually taken to mean some sort of small, creepy crawly that lives on or inside another organism, to the detriment of the latter. We only received a slightly more sophisticated explanation during our medical training, but in essence, the overall idea was the same. Around 2009, my husband Mark became immersed in Austrian economics and anarchist philosophy. I remember he would have a smile on his face while reading Murray Rothbard's publications due to the blunt language Rothbard used to describe the economic and socio-political arrangements we lived under. And one of the things that stood out in Rothbard's writing was the use of the word parasite. For example, he would say, "Rule by the statist elite is not benign or simply a matter of who happens to be in office. It is rule by a growing army of leeches and parasites, battening off the income and wealth of hard-working Americans, destroying their property, corrupting their customs and institutions, sneering at their religion." Unlike you and me, governments do not produce useful goods and services that they can sell on the market. Governments, rather than producing and selling services, live parasitically off the market and off society. Indeed, if we trace the history of the word parasite, it meant feeding beside, deriving from 1500s French to mean a hanger-on, a toady, person who lives on others. Also from the Greek parasitos, one who lives at another's expense, or a person who eats at the table of another. Regarding the biological relationship between organisms, Wikipedia's parasitism entry states that modern parasitology developed in the 19th century with accurate observations and experiments by many researchers and clinicians. The term was first used in 1870. Here we find a link to the CDC's About Parasites page that states, "A parasite is an organism that lives on or in a host organism and gets its food from or at the expense of its host." There are three main classes of parasites that can cause disease in humans: protozoa, helminths, and ectoparasites. In brief, protozoa are single-celled microbes such as amoeba and plasmodia. They are generally larger and more complex than bacteria, but still microscopic. Helminths are multicellular worms such as flatworms and roundworms. The adult forms can be so large that they are easily visible to the naked eye.
Can anybody guess what this stuff is and what I'm going to use it for? This is mullein that I picked out of my garden.
Ectoparasites usually attach to the surface of a host and include fleas, ticks and mites, such as the one involved in scabies. They can be very small but are often visible to the naked eye. The ectoparasites are also claimed to cause disease by acting as vectors for the transmission of pathogenic microbes. We have specifically addressed this faulty aspect of germ theory in our presentations, including those on Lyme disease, yellow fever, and dengue fever. The ectoparasites are a good starting point for the next part of our analysis because of their ease in being seen and the readily observable environmental factors. Take, for example, scabies. When we were in medical school, we were told that they are highly contagious mites and to be extremely careful when in direct contact with patients. That is not actually true, and the mites do not hop onto healthy hosts in this fashion. Even the mainstream textbooks admit that prolonged contact is required. However, then their inconsistencies reappear as they claim infestation is easily spread to sexual partners and household members, and by sharing clothing, towels, and bedding. The New Zealand Ministry of Health's scabies leaflet has similar information, although it also delivers an interesting warning in the form of don't share a bed or clothes with someone who has untreated scabies. I would suggest that it would be a good time to take stock of your lifestyle if that choice is being pondered.
You know you're not in high finance, considering second-hand underpants. Check your mind, how'd it get so bad? What happened to those other underpants you had?
Anyway, in all seriousness, how many times do we see the same theme where clusters of disease are put down to contagion rather than common environmental conditions? In the 1800s, Florence Nightingale provided advice on exactly how to prevent this type of problem. Simple attention to hygiene, and you can watch my video, Florence versus the Germ Machine, for more information about this. Scabies is associated with poor housekeeping, including inadequate cleaning of bedding and clothing. In recent years, there has apparently been a rise in scabies cases amongst students in New Zealand. In response, establishment doctors recommended topical insecticide creams, and if that didn't work, then an oral pharmaceutical in the form of ivermectin. Ivermectin has been doing the rounds for a long time now. Firstly, as a blockbuster big pharma veterinary product in the 1980s. Then by the 1990s, it was being trialled for human population-wide experimentation in places such as the Solomon Islands. The WHO report from that project states that the drug was a, quote, gift from Merck, Sharp and Dohme. If you want to see why the synthetic compound ivermectin is not a gift, then please watch the Ivermectin Games, where I also cover its role in propagating the COVID-19 fraud. Coming back to the topic of ectoparasites, while insecticides may certainly kill mites, they don't address why they took hold in the first place. This is a terrain issue, not just involving hygiene, but also the underlying terrain of the individual. That is, factors such as their nutritional state. In the modern era, people are also damaging their skin in ways they may not realise. You can watch my video, Better Skin with No Soap, for some of the best tips in dealing with this matter. Over the years, Mark and I have also fielded an increasing number of questions about pet health as people realise that their vets may also be under the spell of germ theory and allopathic dogma. We typically deal with this in our fortnightly members Q&A sessions, and relevant to the present video, fleas fall under the category of ectoparasites. We have never once seen any fleas on our dog or our cat, and neither of them have ever received any flea treatments. Our strategy? We provide them with top quality raw meat diets and regularly clean their bedding to maintain their coats and skin. Again, this comes back to a terrain issue, and if your pet has fleas, the underlying reason is not a lack of chemical insecticides. The next group of alleged parasites to address are helminths or worms. To see the problem with this story, it is important to know that some of these worms can produce hundreds of thousands of eggs each. Wikipedia's parasitic worm entry then explains that helminth eggs remain viable for 1 to 2 months in crops and for many months in soil, fresh water and sewage, or even for several years in faeces, fecal sludge and sewage sludge. It goes on to say that helminth eggs are resistant to various environmental conditions due to the composition of the eggshell. In other words, it is inevitable that all of us are going to inhale and ingest these tiny worm eggs that are all around us. These eggs are coming into our gastrointestinal tract on a regular basis, and yet we are not all filling up with worms. Why? Because, like all eggs, they will only hatch if the conditions, that is, the terrain, is suitable. This is in the same category as anthrax spores, which we all inhale at some stage, and yet the vast majority of us never get sick from those either. In any case, we will come back to worms soon to consider them together with the final class of human parasites, which are protozoa. Compared to most of the other alleged parasites, protozoa are truly microscopic. In some ways they are similar to bacteria, being small and unicellular, although in contrast to bacteria, they do not have a cell wall and do have a cell nucleus. A classic example is Entamoeba histolytica, a so-called parasite said to cause amoebiasis or amoebic dysentery. Wikipedia's amoebiasis entry makes the claim that evidence from the Philippines in 1913 found that upon swallowing cysts of E. histolytica, volunteers developed the disease. The citation given is Chapter 49, Intestinal Protozoa, in the 23rd edition of Manson's Tropical Infectious Diseases. We know that a textbook won't be the original source, but the relevant chapter states that
Hej, jeg hedder Nikolaj, og jeg kommer fra Savalstov. I dag vil jeg fortælle lidt om vores...
In 1913, Walker and Sellars definitively established the pathogenicity of E. histolytica by feeding cysts to volunteers. This refers to a 77-page paper that was published the same year in the Philippine Journal of Science. The experiments were performed at Bilibid Prison in the Philippines on men who had long sentences to serve and were reported to have volunteered for the project. The investigators approached the study with their germ goggles on, and to them it was more about finding which variety of amoeba caused disease rather than what caused disease. For example, in the introduction they state, all of the men to whom pathogenic amoeboid organisms had been fed. A major red flag was raised when they admitted the following. Each culture of amoeba consisted of a single species of amoeba, but associated with it was the mixed bacterial growth from the source from which it was cultivated. No attempt was made to isolate the amoebae in pure mixed cultures with one species of bacterium. In other words, there were a variety of contaminants in the broths that the men were swallowing. In one instance, the authors reported that the patient from whom these entamoeba were obtained died at 11 o'clock in the morning. A necropsy was performed at 1:30 and the entamoebae were ingested by men 3 and 35 at 2:30 in the afternoon. So there is no way that this was an isolated entamoeba culture and the subjects were simply swallowing diseased material from a freshly deceased human. Furthermore, in another part of the paper they stated that the material containing Entamoeba histolytica, as in the case of the amoeba and Entamoeba coli, was mixed with powdered starch or magnesium oxide enclosed in a gelatin capsule and ingested by the experimental men. The use of magnesium oxide to neutralise the acidity of the contents of the stomach in the experiments with Entamoeba histolytica was in order to secure parasitisation. Obviously, this is not replicating what happens in nature, and although the authors admitted this, they did not think it altered their conclusions. However, even with these unnatural methodologies, what were the results of their experiments? Of the 20 men who ingested Entamoeba histolytica, 17 became parasitised at the first feeding. One required 3 successive feedings before becoming permanently parasitised, and 2 who did not become parasitised at the first feeding were reserved as controls. Now, when they say, quote, parasitised, what they are actually referring to is the microbe being found subsequently in the men's stools. It has nothing to do with disease. Indeed, the wheels fall off when they state, of the 18 men experimentally parasitised with Entamoeba histolytica, 4, or 22%, have developed entamoebic dysentery. In other words, the majority of subjects who ingested the microbe, 16 out of 20, did not exhibit any disease, including those found to have it in their stool. Keep in mind that although they talk about this microbe as if it was an independent variable, the men were swallowing other contaminants as well.
Prøv at se. Hvis du ikke køber den her, så køber jeg den sgu. Der er både testinkler og folk, der mængler.
Skuffesal. Patricia-villager. Kun et riffelskud for vandet. Skal vi ikke starte med, at du fortæller mig lidt om din bolig?
Jo. Det er en treværelses.
Ja.
Dejlig lys.
Introducing the Quadlock Cup Holder Mount. Secure, sleek, and simple. No block controls, no clutter, just a clean, functional setup that...
The authors then imaginatively offered that the large percentage of latent infections, 78%, among these experimentally parasitised men was somewhat unexpected. The term latent infection is clearly inappropriate, as these men did not go on to exhibit any symptoms of disease. It is of course a complete violation of Koch's first postulate, which states the microorganism must be found in abundance in all organisms suffering from the disease, but should not be found in healthy organisms. While the germ proponents will try to dismiss this point, it simply exposes their complete pseudoscience through the invocation of an unfalsifiable hypothesis. They can't hide the fact that the microbe is everywhere, in both the healthy and the sick. That's why the amoebiasis entry on Wikipedia deals with this inconvenient fact by farcically claiming that most infected people, about 90%, are asymptomatic. I want to come back to one more aspect of their methodology, which relegated this whole experiment even further into the dustbin of pseudoscience. Remember when the authors stated that 2 men who did not become parasitised at the first feeding were reserved as controls? They could not be considered as controls because they swallowed the same broths that were given to the other subjects. It is impermissible to describe them as controls based on the observed reaction, that is, the dependent variable being different. Not that they had isolated an independent variable correctly in their methodology either. Anyway, it highlighted the fact that there were no valid controls in these experiments. Valid controls would have involved a group of men being given exactly the same broths, except with the single microbe in question being filtered out. The staff and subjects would also need to be blinded to what was being swallowed. The experiments were certainly poorly done, but were adequate enough to refute their own hypothesis that the protozoan instigated disease. However, to this day, the study continues to be cited as, quote, evidence that entamoeba is a pathogenic parasite. Often protozoa and worms are considered together as intestinal parasites. A 2023 review article in Gastroenterology Research stated that intestinal parasitic infections pose a global health problem affecting over 1 billion people worldwide. Although these infections are predominantly seen in the developing world, they are frequently seen in the developed countries, particularly in immunocompromised patients. The article goes on to state that the most important factors include tropical and subtropical climates, overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, insufficient pure water supply, low income, low level of education, and poor knowledge about hygiene, food handlers with intestinal parasitic infections, and poor personal hygiene. Even with acceptance of the mainstream's terms, those with a scientific mind will see a problem here. The alleged parasites are not an established independent variable. Perhaps in times of illness, particular microbes will become more prolific, or worm eggs will hatch into adult worms, but this has nothing to do with disease causation, as has been claimed. Any change in the so-called parasite's behaviour, whether it be proliferation or hatching, is simply a result of a change in the terrain. Additionally, alleged microbial parasites such as protozoa can change into a cystic form, which is similar to the concept of bacterial pleomorphism. Our world is pro-life, and the concept of pathogens and parasites is a misunderstanding of how nature's symphony plays out.
How long before I see results with Tai Chi? Day 3, you'll feel your energy. Day 7, your eyes will change. Day 28, you will become unrecognizable.
We are not under attack by anything but bad ideas and the establishment's allopathic propaganda. So we encourage those who promote the dangerous parasite narrative to look into the foundational publications to see how the claims do not stack up. They may also want to consider cui bono, or to whom is it a benefit. The major beneficiaries of the parasite narrative are the pharmaceutical industry, as well as the agencies that wish to dictate policy agendas at a population-wide level. And what about the hype surrounding parasites causing cancer? Well, this is not some sort of cover-up, as the theme has featured in establishment publications for years. Additionally, cancer rates have soared over the past century, whereas these alleged parasites have been around for far longer. The argument is as flawed as claiming that our genes are suddenly causing cancer. I am not claiming to know the full roles of all of the various, quote, parasites, but they appear to be cleanup crews and nature's warning about the local terrain. It follows that the war on germs and parasites is a phony one, and there is no path to true health through spraying or ingesting various chemical compounds. As Dr. Ulrich Williams remarked on this matter last century, the bug hunters are in for a protracted chase. Likewise, I encourage people to break free from the fear narratives in order to take real responsibility for health through right thinking and right living. If you or someone you love needs any guidance in this area, then please check out all of the free resources at drsambailey.com. If you enjoyed this video, please visit supportdrsam.com.